Hello and welcome everybody to our webinar on identity protection and ITDR. And we wait 2 more minutes, Jimmy, before we start to give all the participants the opportunity to join. So we're waiting 1 more minute and then we will start. So, Jimmy, as this is an urgent and important topic, should we now start?
Good to go.
Okay, great. Then welcome everybody to Identity Protection and ITDR, Security Beyond IAM and EDR. Before we go into the details, please feel free to ask questions via the question section here in GoToWebinar. After we are done with our presentations, we will have an interactive discussions and pick up the questions you sent us. Here, together with me, is Jimmy Richmond. Jimmy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. So good to see everyone on the call today. I'm Jimmy. I'm the identity specialist at CrowdStrike, so focused purely on the identity threat detection and response module that we have within our portfolio. And today we'll be looking at why endpoint protection alone is just not good enough when it comes to those attacks that we're seeing. So we'll look through some insights around what we're seeing in the latest global threat report, how identity protection could help you, and of course, what we can do as an action point off of today. So good to see you all.
Great to have you here, Jimmy. You said endpoint protection is not enough. Unfortunately, identity access management is also not enough. And that's the reason why I'm here in the call today together with you and look into that kind of attacks and threats from the identity perspective. My name is Andri. I'm the CTO of IC Consult. So a few words on our company. So IC Consult is completely focused on identity and access management and of course securing digital identities wherever they are used. With a proven track record, more than 2,000 identity access management projects delivered worldwide with more than 850 employees. That's absolutely focusing on identity-driven cyber security and vendor independent, but of course working together with the best vendors in the market. Therefore, it's great to do that webinar here together with CrowdStrike today. We are located around the world with a very, very strong focus here in the UK, continental Europe, and US, and offering a broad range of services whenever it comes to digital identities, advisory and strategy consulting on the one side, building solutions and operated as well. So, but enough of these boring marketing informations. Let's jump directly into the topic of Taylor Swift and the role Taylor Swift has on shaping the identity access management industry. So you ask yourself, okay, what is here the point? Why are we talking about Taylor Swift? It's still work time, right? This is because of a thing happening that happened last year. Let's look on identity data breaches. Here we see interesting picture showing the size of identity data breaches. As larger as a circle is, as more identity records have been affected. From 2018 until last year, caused by poor security configurations. So we are talking here really about misconfigurations, exposed data by accident, database not protected by any passwords, exposed directly to the internet, these kind of things. And the good message here is that the number of data breaches caused by that poor security configurations is really decreasing. The bad thing is, if you now compare it to really sophisticated attacks, we see the absolutely opposite thing. So data breaches caused by sophisticated attacks are massively increasing for a couple of reasons. We'll talk about that later. But what you see on the right top corner here is Ticketmaster, that have been affected by a huge breach. Also, that's a very bad thing about that. Taylor Swift concerts were affected by that breach. But let's look a little bit into what was happening there. So root cause was an identity theft, not of a Ticketmaster employee, of a contractor, not for a system operated by Ticketmaster themselves, but a SaaS service. In that case, Snowflake. With a weak security configuration applied to it. But anyhow, the identity theft of a contractor was a starting point for that attack, and the consequences were massive. So digital tickets has been exposed, but also customer data that has been exposed, and therefore Ticketmaster paid identity monitoring services for their affected customers. So you're not interested in Taylor Swift? You're not interested in concerts? Good in that case, but I'm quite sure a lot of you heard about the largest exposure of identity data ever last week. 16 billion passwords collected from by info stealers, but also breaches brought together from Facebook, Google, Apple, and many others have been exposed. Yeah, so this is really the massive amount of a starting point for identity theft, and I would say nobody cannot saying, okay, I'm not interested in it, yeah, right? Because 16 billion is a massive number. So there's a lot of publications around that. Also, papers like Guardian picked up that topic. So feel free to look into that, and please check if your personal accounts are affected. Passwordless is obviously the better way to deal with it. But we have to be aware that there are also attacks that are focusing really on bypassing whatever authentication mechanisms we brought in place. Beginning of this year, or end of last, beginning of this year, was a very targeted attack on developers of Chrome browser extensions. So, and the attackers were really able to publish malicious code in popular Chrome browser extensions. And with that, they have then, of course, access to not just credentials like passwords, but also session cookies, access tokens, refresh tokens. So sessions that are issued after successful multi-factor authentication, so that the attacker is able to bypass also these kind of very strong mechanisms. Yeah? And also traditional endpoint protection isn't able to see that, because of extension so far was absolutely trustworthy component. So let's wrap things up. So what is a massive challenge we all are facing is that the prevention mechanisms on the identity layer, like multi-factor authentication, like having a rock solid life cycle in place. So also deprovisioning and deactivating accounts that are not in use anymore, and based on leaving the company, for instance. These mechanisms are bypassed. Then the visibility into systems like the SaaS service is often very limited, and also the visibility on devices might be very limited in case it's a contractor. You're not, as an organization, providing them any managed smartphones, notebooks. But that's something what he's bringing in, and it's also increasing the risk associated with that. Yeah. And therefore, the approach we have to take is really looking on what is happening on the identity layer to be able to detect the ongoing attack based on user behaviors, for instance, but also looking in depth into the places identity sessions are used, validated, to understand as soon as something changes in the environment that should force us to invalidate a session instead of using it longer, or forcing to do MFA again, regardless that has been done 10 minutes ago, because now the parameters around that changed. We want to have some additional evidence on that, and let's look into the massive increase of cybercrime we are facing. That's a huge growth over the last 5 years, and the expectation is that this growth will not decrease by any means. The next thing really is published by CrowdStrike and the excellent global threat report, is the insights and understanding what attackers are focusing on and what they don't focusing on anymore. So 79% of the attacks have been malware free, focusing on different layers and attack vectors like the identity layer. That's the reason why we have to focus on that. And then, as mentioned before, the focus on really getting hands on the credentials to just log into the systems. And GenAI is a massive accelerator for these kind of attacks. Yeah, if you look into the into spear phishing, for instance, there's been a very exciting study about the efficiency gain on spear phishing based on GenAI, and no surprise, that's huge. As well for really the discovery phase, but also on really framing a perfect message for an individual. So the cost savings for the attacker is 95%. So spear phishing that was used before, I would say for a lot smaller, interesting group of users, can now be used at scale. At the same quality a human expert is able to achieve, and we are talking about success rates of more than 50%, that the victim is clicking the link, entering credentials, downloading software. Therefore, identity security is really the development we have to focus on. So not just bringing identity in place as a prevention layer, but also having a good understanding of the identity security posture, but especially the ability to detect an attack on the identity layer, to respond to it, and to recover after a successful attack, because you have to bring up the identity layer back after a successful attack in order to operate again. And with that, I would like to hand over to you, Jimmy, that you drive us through CrowdStrike's perspective on protecting the identities.
Absolutely. So I will share my screen out. We will see that now. So as Andre mentioned a second ago, why is endpoint protection and identity access management not enough? So I'm Jimmy. I'm the identity specialist here at CrowdStrike, covering pretty much the whole of Europe right now. So as I mentioned earlier on, focusing purely on the identity threat detection and response module that we have in our portfolio. Now, just to give you a bit of insight into why identity is important, why everything that CrowdStrike does is important, we track 257 global adversaries on a daily basis. Now, you can see a lot of adversaries scattered across the globe here in different regions of the world, but to pick two in particular here that we are seeing more prominently in the news, particularly lately, I'd like to pick out Famous Chalima and Scattered Spider. Now, both are very similar in nature in terms of how they initiate their attacks, but they also have some key differences between them. So the similarities being that they're both very much financially motivated. They both tend to use those initial access methods, and their goal is to achieve lateral movement. Now, how do they actually achieve this? Well, they both use very similar social engineering tactics. They both use attempts in vishing, which we've seen more apparent recently, particularly in news articles. But the differences between them is that Famous Chalima is particularly a nation state actor. So they are based in North Korea, while Scatter Spider doesn't really actually have a kingpin and tends to be individuals around the world working as a group. Now, of course, we're here today to talk about the challenges that are faced when you don't have identity threat detection and response. But to delve into a few of the numbers around our recently produced global threat report, you will see some of the numbers here present in why risks are still out there, why these risks are growing in nature, and how we can help. Now, to pluck out some of these numbers, the first of which is that increase in voice phishing. Now, this is a seismic number that we've seen increase year on year from the very previous global threat report, 442% increase in voice phishing in 2024. Such a huge number increase. This isn't just a small number. This is a 442% massive increase in voice phishing that we're seeing. You may have heard last year with MGM, that was a voice phishing that sadly caused that to occur. And of course, we've seen it with a number of retailers in the UK that has been publicized in the papers in recent weeks. Now, of course, when it comes to these attacks, something else that we see is the increase in broker activity. Now, when we talk about access brokers, 50% increase here year on year. These are credentials that are being readily sold on the dark web, potentially through an auction where individuals are placing bids to obtain a set of credentials that they could then use to gain that initial access into an organization. So again, not necessarily a sophisticated attack, but taking advantage of leaked credentials on the web, something that Andre touched on earlier on. Now, of course, there are other things that we see in terms of this initial access. It could be vulnerabilities, but two huge numbers that we have seen in our global threat report previous to there now was the lateral movement. Now, at CrowdStrike, we record this lateral movement timing in the form of a breakout time. So breakout time is the time between that initial access and moving laterally within an environment. To give you an indication of numbers here, when I joined CrowdStrike back in February last year, we were at 2 minutes 7 seconds as the quickest breakout time. At the time, it was 62 minutes average. This year, we're down to 51 seconds with an average of 48 minutes. So we've broken the minute boundary, we've broken that hour boundary for the time that it takes an adversary to get that initial access and move laterally. This is just re-emphasizing the importance of being able to react in real time rather than investigating something after it has actually happened. The other scary statistic here is that the majority of these attacks, 79% of them, are hands-on keyboard related to identity. They're no longer malware-based attacks that we are typically seeing. We're seeing a huge number of attacks being actual individuals, hands-on keyboard, taking advantage of credentials to obtain access to an organization and move laterally. Now, This really does allude, and you will see inside the global threat report, that identity really is at the heart of many breaches that we're seeing. Now, we'll go into in a second what the different types of attacks and how they could look, the different threats. But of course, as we keep saying, these adversaries are no longer breaking in, they're no longer trying to deploy malware to obtain access to an organization. They're taking advantage of credentials that are freely available on the dark web, whether they pay for them or whether they have acquired them in the past in previous breaches. And of course, just to re-emphasize here, that breakout time, the average being 48 minutes. How quick could you determine that access, that initial access, and being able to look at whether someone has moved laterally within the environment? Would it be 48 minutes? Would it be significantly longer? The number of conversations that I have with customers, it is a lot longer than 48 minutes to be able to detect that sort of activity. Now, one of the other things just to point out here is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Now, with endpoint protection alone, you're only going to get visibility of around 5 out of 10 of those tactics. So what about the other 5 out of 10 tactics? And of course, they reside under the identity-based tactics that we would see. So initial access, lateral movement, persistence, the creation of accounts within an environment. Of course, without identity threat detection and response, you would have limited visibility of these. Now, let's dig into what two of the threats look like. So we have our external threats and we have our internal threats. The external threats, as we see typically in the news, are those trying to essentially gain access to the organization from the outside world, very similar to the likes of ScatterSpider, where they're looking to obtain a set of credentials, whether that be via phishing, whether that be via the dark web, buying a set of credentials and gaining access to an application or Active Directory, and then looking to move laterally within the environment, potentially leading to them deploying ransomware or even stealing intellectual property to essentially have that financial gain. We then have the insider threat. The internal threat itself is a lot harder to detect. Now, in the past, these internal threats would be seen maybe as disgruntled employees, maybe very upset with how they've been treated within the organization, and then causing chaos internally, or maybe stealing information, taking it elsewhere, maybe selling it to competitors. However, with the likes of the threat actors that we are tracking, like famous Chalima, for instance, they could actually be employees that have been deliberately hired. As in, when I say deliberate, I mean they've actually applied for a role knowing they work for a nation state actor to gain access to an organization, to take advantage of maybe the access they've been given within the organization to establish that persistence through the creation of accounts to essentially exfiltrate that data. Now, we'll touch on in a minute how we would detect both of these threats, but just giving you an idea there of what we are seeing around different types of attack. Now, in the past, you may have even seen this slide before. Threat actors in the past have taken advantage of the different stages of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, typically taking advantage of that initial access to then discover accounts that maybe have privileges on them, maybe finding an account that has further privileges, maybe has a duplicate password with the account they've been able to get that initial access with, essentially obtaining lateral movement, and then maybe deploying that ransomware at the very end. However, we're seeing a change here in terms of that trend. We're seeing threat actors start from the lateral movement part. They've already obtained a set of credentials that have got privileges associated with them, whether these been through a purchase, whether they've been through a breach that they've taken these credentials. It could be the case that they found a set of credentials to a domain admin account, for instance, and they've already then obtained that lateral movement, and then they can deploy that ransomware and really cause chaos within an organization, something we don't want to see happen anywhere. Now, in terms of those different tactics that we see within the MITRE ATT&CK framework, just listing these out in front of you now, you'll see it all the way from that initial access, the execution, persistence, defense evasion, credential access. The one thing that you will see becoming apparent on this slide, though, this heat map in front of you, is the valid accounts that are used within a number of those. These valid accounts are accounts that are being used within an organization. They're being taken advantage of, whether they have purchased them on the dark web, whether they've obtained them through phishing attacks, whether it be brute force attacks or password spraying. These are different ways that they can take advantage of these accounts to hit that different tactic within the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the initial access, for instance, taking advantage of those valid accounts, persistence, coming in with an account that maybe only has a little bit of access, but then creates other accounts that do have privileges assigned to them, or even accounts that they've created to obtain privilege escalation. So highlighting here how the different world attacks that we are viewing through our Overwatch team at CrowdStrike, how they are seeing the different techniques used within them, as you can see here, valid accounts being a huge factor within them. Now, if we were to step through a threat, as we saw earlier on, we saw external threats and we saw internal threats. We're not going to talk about both today. If you would like to hear about how we can combat internal threats, we can certainly arrange a more personal conversation to talk about how we can look at insider activities, prompt for MFA, or even block access that they're doing. But let's have a look at the external threat here on this slide. Now, on this slide here, you can see, for instance, from a credential access perspective, it could be password spraying that is used by an adversary to gain valid credentials. Once they've obtained those valid credentials, they would then gain entry into the organization. It could be the initial access point, so social engineering used to trick users into gaining their credentials or allowing them to have additional access into the organization. From a lateral movement perspective, we could use those valid credentials to pivot across the different systems within the environment. It could be that we start with AED, maybe move up into Entra from a hybrid lateral movement perspective. It could be that I start on one endpoint and I move to another endpoint that maybe has got privileges assigned to it and take advantage of that. Now, from a discovery perspective, we want to collect as many credentials as possible as an adversary. This could be using something like Kerberoasting or LDAP searches to be able to obtain insights into those accounts that are present within the environment, preferably ones as an adversary. I would want ones that have got privileges assigned to them. Now, of course, there's then the reconnaissance stage. We want to understand as much about our targets within the organization as much as possible, particularly if we want to initiate that vishing or social engineering aspect. So I could be looking at LinkedIn, for instance, to target high-value individuals to understand more about them. So when I do ring up the help desk, I can impersonate them as well as possible. So someone actually thinks I am them at the end of the day. And of course, the final stage there is where we essentially are able to collect or deploy that impact off the back of it. So really, when we're looking at these different stages of an external threat, I think we really need to ask ourselves, how would you be alerted about these different stages of activity within your environment? Would you have that insight from endpoint protection and identity access management alone? Would you actually know this is going on? And how quickly could you do something about it? Now, to help with these threats, whether it be external or internal, we have Falcon Identity Protection. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Falcon Identity Protection is the module in our platform that looks at all of the identity events within an environment. And of course, it's a module that I focus purely on here at CrowdStrike. Now, there are three ways that identity threat protection works. The first of which is gaining visibility of the risks within our environment. How do we understand whether a risk could become a threat or potentially a detection or potentially a breach at the end of the day? I can't tell you how many times whenever I speak to organizations that we see basic risks that could be very easily resolved, but maybe they're not aware of. This could be duplicate passwords. It could be compromised passwords. It could be overprivileged accounts. It could be attack paths to privilege. There's a ton of different risks that we can see here, and that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our identity protection solution. We then have the detection side of things. How do we alert you about anomalous or even malicious activities going on within your environment, both for Entra and AD, or even Okta, for instance? So from a detection perspective, we are looking at this authentication traffic. We are looking for patterns of behavior that could be malicious in nature or even anomalous, as I mentioned earlier on. When we see these patterns of behavior, we can trigger those alerts for you to go and investigate and potentially isolate an endpoint or even put a user onto a watch list so they can no longer access certain resources across your estate. We then have the real-time protection. One thing we have probably established today is adversaries are getting quicker and quicker, and they're moving laterally at a faster pace than ever before. So how do we deal with that in a time frame that beats them? Well, we need to have that real-time protection. We need to be able to prompt a user for MFA or block them from accessing resources in a real-time manner, not 2 hours after the event has occurred, but as and when they try to access those resources. So real-time protection, as I mentioned earlier on, can be the ability to block access to specific resources, or it could be as simple as using the MFA providers that you have today to prompt them for MFA to prevent them from moving laterally further or even having privilege escalation. Now, there's obviously a lot more within our platform to help you with understanding risks within your environment. The one thing to highlight here are the petabytes of data that we collect on a daily, weekly, yearly basis to understand adversaries and new tactics and tradecraft that might be used. It could be things like dark web monitoring, our cloud security capabilities, our endpoint protection, as we mentioned earlier on, our threat intel teams that have human threat hunters within them looking at new tradecraft that is being used by adversaries. It could be looking at our SIEM to understand and look into the data in a much more granular level. But essentially, we have some key outcomes here that we aim to provide our customers. The first of which is visibility, understanding the misconfigurations, understanding whether compromised credentials or whether there are attack paths to privilege within an environment, understanding if adversaries are taking advantage of maybe data that on our organization that is freely available out there. But we understand that visibility is only one key component. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we need to be alerted about certain activities that are going on. We need to understand detections that are being triggered within our environment. So we have a complete team, for instance, that would be the managed service wraparound when it comes to the different modules within CrowdStrike. So they can look at these insights, they can triage this data, they can understand the different detections from an endpoint perspective and an identity perspective to alert you about it. Maybe isolate an endpoint, triage the different information they have to get you to work with them, because at the end of the day, they are an extension to your teams. But essentially, the main goal here is we need to respond faster to threats. We need to beat the adversary at the end of the day because they are only getting quicker, so therefore we need to be quicker to prevent them from impacting our organizations. Now, just to bring this together, of course, something we mentioned at the very beginning earlier on is why is endpoint protection not enough? Why do we need identity threat detection and response capabilities as well? So what you can see on here is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The ones in white are what you would get with endpoint protection, so having the visibility of executions that are going on, the discovery that could go on within an organization, the exfiltration and the collection side of things. But you'll see there are some huge gaps there without any identity protection. We wouldn't see the initial access. We wouldn't see the persistence through the creation of accounts. We wouldn't see privilege escalation. We wouldn't see that lateral movement, which is critical in understanding if an adversary is moving across the organization to obtain privilege or even get to the endpoint they want to impact. Now, one thing just to highlight here is the Overwatch team, who are within our CAO capabilities. They are essentially looking over these insights to give you further understanding of new tactics and tradecrafts, as I mentioned earlier on, that adversaries might be using. And of course, they can input into the different areas here. We even have our Overwatch for identity capabilities, where we're understanding things that are going on within an environment to create new detections for you. So showing you here how it is so important to not just have an endpoint coverage and not just to have identity coverage, but to have both together so you have a full understanding of what is going on within an environment. So just to wrap this up, what can we do for you today off the back of this, if it is something that you think is something you would like to have a look into? One thing that we do offer is an identity security risk review. I conduct these on a weekly basis with many different organizations. It's completely free, even better when it's free. And essentially what we do is we are looking into the insights around identities within your environment. We will then have a look at the risks associated with them, and we will build a presentation for you so you can understand those risks, how you can mitigate them, and how we could help you further in the future with maybe putting enforcement policies in place or having detection capabilities in there, understanding the traffic that's going on within an environment. So it's like turning the lights on within a very dark house, which could be your identities, and allowing us to tell you about the risks that we have seen, and how you could mitigate those risks themselves. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you all today. If you do have any questions, please do reach out. I'm going to pass you back over to Andre, and if we do have any questions, we'll be very happy to answer those. So thank you for your time today.
Jimmy, thank you very much for this great insights into the CrowdStrike perspective on the topic of identity threats and how to deal with that. I would like to ask one question to you. So, honestly, I think many organizations are in this situation that I would say teams working on the XDR side of and on the identity access management side are somehow separated. What is your recommendation for organizations how to make this a joint effort?
So the first challenge we often see when it comes to maybe challenges around joint efforts is when there are different portals being used for different insights into whether it be identity or whether it be into endpoint. Having that collated and correlated makes your life so much easier, but not just easier, allows you to respond quicker to threats that we are seeing. So we speak to customers that maybe have got an endpoint protection solution from one vendor and maybe have some identity capabilities, maybe from freeware or open source software that they're using, and essentially just don't have that instant correlation between insights. So of course, I'm going to say that having it all available in one area with it automatically correlated for you is not only going to make your life easier, but allow you to respond immediately to that. And that's where the endpoint protection and identity threat detection and response capabilities of CrowdStrike immediately give you those correlated insights. So you would have that available.
Yes, and the attackers are not just limiting themselves on one particular area. No, they are looking what is the best way to move forward, right, and are very flexible and leveraging all the capabilities to get into that. And as you highlighted, the numbers, especially the 51 seconds until the lateral movement takes place, shows clearly how fast we have to be in order to stop attackers in time. Yeah? And if you don't have all the information available, but have to really collect them from different sources, correlate them, and understanding what's going on there, attackers already move forward to the next systems and doing harm there. So time matters in that case.
Absolutely. I can give a bit more insight as well. So I speak regularly with our sort of like IR, our incident response team. So individuals like our analysts, complete analysts that are looking at environments all the time. And I asked them the other day, what's the most common attack that we often see happening within organizations, even ones that we aren't necessarily working with already? And for those customers that don't have anything from CrowdStrike, the biggest threat we see is coming from endpoints they have no visibility of whatsoever. Endpoints that are maybe left around within an environment, maybe an adversary using an endpoint that isn't even in their environment to take advantage of identities or try and gain access into the organization. And to me, that's a very simple use case to resolve, even just with identity threat detection and response, like the identity protection solution. Because with our enforcement policies, we can block authentications from an endpoint which doesn't have the Falcon sensor on it. So it doesn't have to be difficult to actually fix these challenges that a lot of organizations are facing. But that was one thing I heard the other day, which I thought was pretty insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that's a very, very good example because, well, in a complex organization, there might be endpoints that you can't manage, yeah? Like contractors that are very, very often entry point protectors. But as an organization, you can make a decision what resources might be accessed from an unmanaged device and what are not, right? And that's something what you can do and should do in order to really make sure that, well, for instance, the thing that happened few months ago already in the UK, right? But the impact is still there for a very large retail fashion organization, to prevent these kind of things happening, right? So I think that's a thing. And another topic, you touched briefly, Jimmy, but typically what attackers want to get hands on are the highly privileged accounts, escalating the privileges. You mentioned the just-in-time capabilities around privileged access. Maybe you can highlight a little bit what CrowdStrike's plans and reasons for going into that direction are, and how your customers are using these capabilities today.
Absolutely. So when I think of identity, particularly at CrowdStrike, I think of 4 pillars, basically. So the 4 pillars are having visibility into those risks in your environment. The second pillar, understanding the activities that are going on from a traffic perspective. So what users are typically accessing, what's normal behavior, what's anomalous, what is potentially malicious. Then the third pillar is the real-time response. So being able to prompt for MFA when there is access outside of the baseline of an account. And then there's the fourth pillar. How do we reduce that attack surface in the first place? And that's the bit that you allude to there, Andre, with having zero standing privileges. One of the biggest threats that we see are adversaries taking advantage of stale accounts that have privileges still assigned to them, where someone has left the organization and maybe the account hasn't been properly deprovisioned or has just been left lying around with privileges associated with it and has a compromised password or has passwords that are being used by other accounts. So we've released our Falcon Privilege Access solution. This is looking to achieve that zero standing privileges, but only giving privilege when you need it, and also looking at the risks associated at your account in the first place. So for instance, if you have got a very high risk score associated with your identity, you may not be able to get global admin permissions within Entra, as an example. So we can use the risks that we understand on an identity to determine whether we actually allow them to elevate it and how long they can elevate it for as well. So we're moving in the direction there now of zero standing privileges and the ability to reduce that attack surface. And I'm sure we'll be doing far more in that area very soon.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely required as an organization to really develop that kind of understanding that we have to get rid of that kind of persistent privileged accounts wherever that is possible. I think, honestly, knowing the complexity in the real life, you have on the one side the very modern SaaS cloud world, I would say, where it's good to a specific degree to achieve that kind of zero standing privilege goal. On the other side, we have the legacy world, unfortunately, still out there, and also still Active Directory as a very crucial, maybe most crucial component for many organizations. I know that a lot of our clients having something to go, okay, we have to get rid of Active Directory. The future is on Entra ID, on Okta, on Ping ID, on all the modern SaaS solutions out there. But what is your perspective on the Active Directory? Not looking, not touching it anymore, with the hope that nothing serious is happening, or you say, okay, still number one target, take care of it. You will not get rid of it very soon.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic when it comes to Active Directory. I speak to different organizations of different sizes all the time, and some have the ambition of moving completely away from it. Of course, the biggest risks that you probably will see or read about are associated with Active Directory because of the legacy protocols involved and the vulnerabilities associated with them and the ability for an adversary to take advantage of it. For instance, Kerber roasting is something that's achievable with the Kerberos protocol, as an example. But of course, there are also risks associated with identity providers where someone can take advantage of SAML, for instance, or other ways that we're authenticating into applications. So understanding different detections there. So I think a lot of organizations would love to move away from Active Directory. It isn't always possible, particularly when there's a lot of infrastructure that lies around in an environment. So it's easier said than done. And of course, with the risks associated, it's hard just to ignore those risks because hybrid lateral movement can easily happen too. So it's having that coverage across not just on premises, but also the cloud aspects too. So it's having just as much visual as possible, even if it's just the risks.
Even if it's just the risks, but also maybe to react on that at runtime. For instance, one example, it's a few years ago, but we were working on an enrollment at scale when it comes to MFA, phishing resistant MFA for the users of the organization. And the one thing is to really reach a high coverage of users that are enabled and work with MFA. But the other thing is, how many of systems are you then protecting via MFA-based authentication, and how many systems would be still accessible via for the attacker Kerberos sting attack, because at the end of the day it's just a Kerberos ticket, or even cached NTLM credential, So these kind of things, and then unfortunately, the answer is yes. All of your users have MFA in place, but unfortunately, only for 60% of the applications we are able to enforce it today. 40%, unfortunately not. And I think then that is really that kind of area in which the identity protection can help us to really enforce at runtime, saying, okay, now you have to do MFA. Regardless, you did it before at another place, another protocol, another level, still there's a risk associated based on older protocols in use here. And the other aspect or positive effect we see there is that this is also giving some pressure to applications that still rely on the old legacy identity world to move to the modern protocols and modern identity providers instead of Active Directory, just because for user convenience. And at the same time, they are then massively increasing their security posture.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. 100%. When we speak to organizations, it's very difficult to apply MFA on premises, and we still see tons of accounts in Entra, for instance, that don't have MFA aligned to them as well. So that's where we have the ability to intercept both of the authentications to those platforms and prompt for MFA via our brokerage of the MFA provider without impacting user experience. So 100%. Sometimes when you don't know what's out there, you just don't know. So that's why we give the visibility of those risks.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Jimmy, to wrap the things up, do you have the last few words and recommendations to the audience what to do next?
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you everyone for your time today. I think the main thing just to flag is if you would like to know more, do give me a shout. We do offer the Identity Security Risk Review. It's completely free. You can just take the results, and even if that just gives you some insights into the risks that you're facing, then I would be happy that it's helped you even just with seeing that. So if I can offer you that Identity Security Risk Review, please do reach out. Happy to help with that. And of course, if there's any questions, please, again, just give me a shout and we'll happily jump on a call to discuss.
Jimmy, thank you very much. I'm absolutely second that. So what we can offer in addition to that kind of security review is really an assessment on what is in place today, what is also covered in a perspective of a zero trust architecture, and what are all the areas in which there are still risks associated, and help to develop a roadmap to bring everything in place to have a robust, secure identity layer that is connected very well with device and network layer to have a holistic perspective on risks and get really as an organization the capability to stop attackers as fast as possible and as necessary. So, Jimmy, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for listening to us, follow that discussion, and hopefully see you soon. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.